Welcome to the third roundtable of today. I mean, I honestly cannot believe we are already at the third roundtable, but the time flies with really interesting conversations. So the last roundtable will focus on the question of commons, continuing the critical discussion around resources and infrastructures of the project of space mining, asking how this new iteration of the space race affects also our understandings of solidarity and commons and shared. We are very happy to welcome Rory Rowan and María Gómez López as our two last symposium speakers before we continue the day with the screening of the film, Cosmic Market and conversation with Armin Linke. We are also very happy to welcome Nick Axel, who will join us today as a co-moderator of the conversation to follow afterwards. So as in previous discussions, I will start with reading short bios and introducing our speakers. So Rory Rowan is an assistant professor of geography at Trinity College, Dublin, whose research spans geopolitics, political ecology, intellectual history, and cultural criticism. He holds a PhD in geography obtained from Royal Holloway, University of London. Rory's current research explores the emerging geopolitics of space resources, the histories of Irish neutrality, and the securitization of green energy in Ireland's Atlantic. He's an editor of Randale, a critical left media project based in Ireland, and frequently contributes writing to academic and art publications. Welcome, Rory. Thank you for joining. María Gómez López is an artist whose practice centers on self-experimentation, history of science, and legacies of utopian thought. Her work has been shown recently at the Stedelijk Museum. I'm never sure how to pronounce the name. Is it correct or close?
Okay. I wish I could tell you.
All right.
Definitively I can't.
Landeskunstmuseum Kunstmuseum Linz and KfW Stiftung, as well as DOK Leipzig and Rencontre International Paris, Berlin. María was a 2023-24 Abigail R. Cohen Fellow at the Columbia Institute for Ideas and Imagination in Paris. She currently teaches as a tutor at the Master in Interior Architecture Sandberg Institute in Amsterdam. Welcome, María. And Nick Axel is an architect, editor, educator, and curator. He's deputy editor of e-flux architecture and head of the architectural design department at the Gerrit Rietveld Academie. Welcome, Nick, too. So thank you so much all for being here. We can now start with the same structure as with previous roundtables. So the two lectures, we take our notes, comments, and we will discuss them in a conversation afterwards. Rory, you can start. Please go ahead.
Thanks so much for the invitation and for everyone for managing to stick around for the day. I'm going to enter with a few apologies, as is maybe something epigenetic Irish to apologize for yourself when you enter the room. But I'm not going to talk that much about commons. I kind of skipped that brief accidentally. It will come up. But also just want to apologize. I was looking at the slides and it's like a potted meat product of horrible colonial white men. So I apologize for that in advance, but they're relevant to be there. And I'm going to slightly zoom out a little bit, I think, compared to a lot of the talks we've had so far. And there's a kind of a risk in that things get a bit reductive when you zoom out. So hopefully that isn't the case. And if anyone has strong feelings, please let me know in the questions. Okay, so let's just check. This is working? No.
I think once more. Yeah.
No. Good. Okay. So I want to go one more. No, I want to go one back. Ooh, what's happening? Sorry, it's in a... Here we are. Now I've got it. Okay. So, on October 31st, 2023, the Houthi forces in Yemen launched a missile attack on Israel with 2 cruise missiles and 1 medium-range ballistic missile that they fired across the Red Sea. And this was an act of solidarity in their terms with the people of Gaza, then already under the bombardment and the start of the Israeli genocide there. Thousands were dead already. And clear intent for a genocidal campaign mentioned by the heads of state and the head of government from Israel. This Houthi ballistic missile was closely modeled on Iran's medium range, and I don't have Persian, so I'm not going to attempt to pronounce it, but the meaning of the name is intensity, so Iran's intensity missiles, and it traveled around 1,000 miles. Of course, it's closely based on the Iranian missile because the Iranians have designed and given them to them, the Houthis, as part of the axis of resistance, so-called. Israel intercepted the Houthi missile about 100 miles above the Earth using the Arrow 3 anti-ballistic missile system, part of their broader anti-missile defense system. And this was widely reported across popular media as the first instance of space war. This is really a misnomer, given that actually satellite systems and guidance systems are involved in all warfare basically today and have been for many, many decades. But it's the first instance of weapons being used within low Earth orbit against other projectiles in low Earth orbit. So it's a kind of the first instance not of space war, but the weaponization of low Earth orbit, rather than the use of technologies in orbit to direct missiles on Earth. And of course, there's a question here about, well, where does space actually begin? Did this take place 100 miles above Earth in space? And the question of where space begins is contested, philosophically and technically and scientifically. One designation is the supposed Kármán line, which is a boundary between Earth and outer space, located roughly around 100 kilometers, 62 miles above the mean sea level. But I guess the more common designation is low Earth orbit, which again is an ambiguous and disputed category, generally considered to be somewhere above 124 miles or 160 kilometers above the Earth, although given the Earth's elliptical and lacking uniform shape, the meaning of this is not quite clear. So low Earth orbit is generally considered to be up to 2,000 kilometers above Earth. So again, questionable whether this was or was not in space, but it was certainly at the boundary of low Earth orbit. The Houthi missile, like other medium-range ballistic missiles, had a multi-stage journey between launch and reaching its target's 3 stages. And it briefly becomes a satellite, as do other such missiles, temporarily moving out of the Earth's orbit and then coming into its descent. They are so-called exo-atmospheric weapons as they leave the Earth's atmosphere. So, I want to go ahead. Will I get it to work? Oh, good, no. So reporting on the incident on November 17th, 2023, and there was a kind of a bit of a lag in the reporting of this, the fantastic publication Popular Mechanics published an article entitled, as we can see, "The groundbreaking ballistic missile intercept was also the first combat in space." Not quite true, but nonetheless. And they wrote in this article, and I quote, that this wasn't the space war you'd expect. It was a battle of missiles between a rebel army and Israel. But yet, a psychological barrier, the idea that space is a domain unspoiled by mankind's vicious infighting, has been breached, and there is no going back. The British tabloid newspaper The Sun, I think I have here a screenshot of the Irish edition, a neo-colonial institution in itself, ran an article on December 6th of 2023, "Israel wins world's first space battle as Arrow 3 shoots down rocket." And as hopefully you can see there, they capitalized space for God knows what reason, but slightly amusing nonetheless. And then the slightly more respectable, not quite a tabloid, but almost a tabloid, The Times, on December 5th, 2023, ran an article with the headline, "How Israel's Arrow 3 intercepted a missile in first space battle." And again, both of these kind of articles take their shape within a kind of attempt of the British media to restore a kind of sense of military supremacy and technological prowess and ingenuity to Israel, to restore its kind of image of invincibility after the October 7th attacks. It kind of shattered that idea that it was a kind of a unattackable, unimpeachable bounded state. And this kind of echoes the kind of discourses around the kind of the pager attack against Hezbollah in Lebanon more recently as dazzling, amazing, incredible, and so on. So a lot of effort put by British and other media, particularly British media, to restore this kind of sense of technological supremacy. The Houthis, interestingly, aren't mentioned in either of these any of these headlines. Rebel armies in some case, but rebel armies, particularly Islamist ones, are not meant to have access to ballistic missiles in the Western imaginary or to know how to do them. But yet The Sun and The Times, interestingly, do mention Israel's Arrow 3 anti-ballistic missile system in the headlines. Hardly a piece of technology or a system that the average reader can be expected to know. So we're kind of presented with almost advertising the Arrow 3 system that gets discussed here. And this is the Arrow 3 system, which is a joint missile defense system only currently used in Israel, but designed between the Israel Armed Forces and the American Armed Forces, and it's a collaboration between the IAI, Israel Aerospace Industries, which is a government-owned corporation, and the American multinational Boeing. And it was first introduced in, I think it's the year 2000. And it predates the so-called Iron Dome system, which we're much more used to perhaps seeing in use defending Israel against attacks from rockets from more proximate. So these are rockets that are flying just above the skyline of the city. This is to take anti-ballistic missile. And I think what's interesting about this is that this is now being presented as part of the European Sky Shield initiative, which is a NATO-backed system to provide air defense systems for Europe and selective countries in Europe. And not all NATO member states are, such as Luxembourg, is not part of this, have not bought into this European Sky Shield initiative, which will involve putting rocket infrastructure, but also paying large sums of money into this. On September 28th, 2023, just 2 weeks before the October 7th attacks, Germany and Israel announced plans for Germany to spend almost $4 billion on acquiring the Israeli-made Arrow 3 system that would start to be delivered in 2025, the end of 2025. A sale, of course, that Washington had to approve as part of this new NATO plan. And Germany will be the main financer of this new system, leading what's called the European acquisition focus of the plan. And in one sense, we can see here Germany's much trumped kind of, strange use of phrase, much vaunted Zeitenwende, or kind of turning point in history after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where Germany was going to kind of relinquish its kind of past of not being a heavily militarized society. It is a very heavily militarized society, so I'm never quite sure what status that it was supposed to have, but that it would be a more assertive military presence, defending not only its own interests, but those of NATO in Europe. And I think we can see this, the meaning of that Zeitenwende is much in Germany's relationship to Israel as it is in your relationship to Ukraine. And interestingly, this system, Arrow 3 system, is the largest ever arms deal for Israel, and Israel Aerospace Industries, the company that produced Arrow 3 with Boeing, have already hired more workers and lengthened shifts in order to meet the 2025 target. And this is against the backdrop of escalating war in Gaza and Lebanon, because many of their workers are actually being called up to the front. So what do we learn from this? Why spend this time in this vignette? Other than I think it's important to mention these things in all gatherings at the minute. We learn that space war, or at least the weaponization of low Earth orbit more correctly, is already here. This is something that we already live with. And it also has profound risks attached to it, including space debris, if this becomes a more common feature of our international relations. But I think more broadly and more importantly, it brings together two of the most prominent and worrying tendencies within the human presence in outer space, militarization and commercialization, and shows that they're intimately linked and bound up together. So what we're kind of in some sense seeing is a new expansion and intensification of the military-industrial complex at an international level through the evolving, expanding space economy. So the idea that I've been kind of trying to kind of kick around with, and I'll talk about a little bit about here, is the idea of the kind of geopolitical economy of outer space. And I'm going to talk about the geopolitical economy of space resources. So what do I mean by this? So in order to understand the changing nature of the human presence in outer space, it's important to approach it from two interconnected conceptual lenses simultaneously, those of geopolitics and political economy, or I argue that it is. Geopolitics here, very broadly understood, is the power relationships between states and other powerful political actors, and the way that those relations are shaped by competition over control of territory, resources, and mobility or movement. And political economy, at a base level, the relationship between the economy and state, including the forms of regulation, investment, and coercion through which the former seeks to manage the latter. And why is this important? I think because it provides us a framework for understanding the interaction between those dynamics of commercialization and militarization that characterize our contemporary moment in space. So what I'll do is I'll kind of talk now a little bit about commercialization, a little bit about militarization, dipping into a couple of details here and there, and then kind of bring it back to thinking about the geopolitical economy of space resources. Let me know if I'm talking too long. So the commercialization of space, and I say commercialization of space 2.0 because, of course, the development of outer space has always been a commercial enterprise. And it's, you know, the shift, the 2.0 here is a familiar story, I'm sure, to everyone here, that we've seen in recent decades, particularly in the last decade, a profound shift where the private sector is taking a greater role in space activities, and governance is kind of, outer space governance is reformulating itself or recalibrating itself around the private sector. And there's new actors, new activities, new industries, new motivations, ambitions, and horizons that are emerging with these well-known kind of actors. And we kind of, I don't think we need to rehearse that very much here. And in some sense, and this is hardly an original point, we can understand this kind of emergence of the commercial space sector, often referred to as new space. That term is kind of itself kind of contested, and it's very placed within a certain context, but we'll use it here as a placeholder. New space is itself part of a broader process of neoliberalizing outer space, and a move to kind of center the private sector and move to center market actors in outer space governance. And in many senses, it's a classic case of neoliberalism. The geographer, the British geographer Jamie Peck, gives a useful kind of way of thinking about different forms of neoliberalism. And in one sense, on one hand, he talks about rollback neoliberalism, which is where a state withdraws from area of activity or provision to produce space for market actors to take place. And I think Obama's decision to cancel NASA's space shuttle program and open up the logistics of NASA to private actors and the awarding of contracts to SpaceX is the most obvious example of this, and has made an enormous monopoly in the relationship of the American state and then also in the private sector. And of course there's legislation in the United States, as there is many other places, against the development of monopolies within the private sector. But what we don't see, where we don't see that, is the monopolies in state procurement of services from private actors. And Peck's other category, in contrast to rollback neoliberalism, is a kind of what he calls a roll-out neoliberalism, which is where the state facilitates the development of markets in new areas. And I'll come back to that in talking about space resources, because I think this is a prime example of that, particularly Luxembourg's program. And what I want to do here, and a little bit this, as I say, kind of zooming back and, like, you know, being slightly polemical here, is that there's a risk in these discussions about new space and the kind of emergence of the private sector as a dominant actor that the state gets kind of pushed to the background. I want to insist that we should bring the state back into our analysis. In fact, not just bring it back, but center it in our understanding. And kind of resist the centering of the private sector in our understanding of what's going on in outer space. And I think the risk is that we repeat the logics and the ideologies and the claims of space capitalists or space entrepreneurs when we do that in our analysis. And I think there's good grounds to recenter the state, because the state remains the primary actor in outer space as an investor, customer, researcher, legislator, regulator, infrastructure provider, diplomatic enabler, and security guarantor. So what do we do then if we bring the state back into our analysis, into the center of our analysis in contemporary outer space? So it's kind of common that we see framings that get down into the weeds of the relationship between the public and the private sector, between the state and capital, and often seeing those kind of presented as opposed to each other. Just before we started, I was talking about an event I spoke at recently in Copenhagen, in a kind of government-funded think tank by the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Defence. And there it was all this discussion of good European social democratic state institutions versus bad American capitalism. And, you know, I do think there is bad American capitalism in the space sector, slightly dubious of the claims of the moral goodness of the European state and the EU, particularly from NATO states. But nonetheless, we can see there's something going on here. But I think as much as this captures, it also obscures other things, and it prevents us from seeing other logics and dynamics at work. And from the perspective of the geopolitical economy, it's better if we look at state and capital working together. And I think the monopoly of actors like SpaceX certainly gave us ground to understand that. So what happens when we start to look at state and capitalism working together, and how when we're analyzing them as kind of coterminous or things that are bound up together. I'm not saying that they have a seamless relationship or a tension-free relationship. That we can look into many cases where that it remains very, very fraught and it remains dynamic. But it brings us back to the kind of terrain of historical materialist analysis and the analysis of imperialism. Imperialism is a deeply unfashionable category today within academia, at least. It's passed out of theoretical fashion as an analytical category. It certainly had kind of a renewed intellectual currency in the early 2000s with the US-led invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, where we had a kind of discussion of a kind of return to direct boots on the ground imperial adventurism or colonial adventurism. And it seemed to kind of lapse and suddenly go out of fashion again as the term war on terror, if not the practices of the war on terror, were kind of retired during Obama's first administration. And I think we've also seen in that period in the last kind of 10 or 15 years, concepts of coloniality and decolonization have come to the fore. And that makes, of course, very good sense. The attempts that are going on to wrestle with the kind of histories of colonialism and their afterlives in the racist structures of the present. And it's not to say here that I want to oppose coloniality and decolonization and analysis of imperialism. I think we need to be doing both of them at the same time. So it's about bringing analysis and critique of empire back into the picture. One case of an attempt to kind of theorize imperialism at the minute, which has its limitations, is the analysis of so-called hyper-imperialism from the Tricontinental, which is a kind of far-left think tank fronted by Vijay Prashad. Many people are critical of them as campists, i.e. they see the world divided up into camps of opposing blocks of states. They do this, and that's a severe limitation because this blocks them from, in my conception, understanding the imperial nature of the Russian state and the Chinese state. They only see imperialism as kind of sin of the West. Nonetheless, their analysis of the Western camp is very, very sound, other than that they see it basically as the prime actor in imperialism in the world. I see the world much more as that being the dominant empire, but there being emerging inter-imperial rivalries that are existing. And one thing I think is useful here, and why I mention it, is that they have an interesting analysis of the place of small states within this Western imperial system, or the kind of NATO-US-led imperial system. And I've marked them with red X's. Luxembourg, where we are, and of course Ireland, where I'm from. These kind of semi-peripheral or inner peripheries within the kind of imperial system, where those small states can act to kind of service the metropole, the dominant power, the United States in this case, whilst competing for position, if not autonomy, within these kind of the peripheries of this imperial system. And I think, again, this is useful for understanding Luxembourg and space resources that we'll come to in a second. So if that was kind of commercialization, quick run through, I want to move quickly to talk about kind of militarization of space. Again, militarization of space 2.0, because it's always been militarized. And I think here empire is crucial to understanding the rapid militarization of outer space as a category. We're not just simply in the realm of states that are competing, it's imperial blocks that are competing with each other as well. And outer space has again become the object of intense geopolitical competition, as it was in the past, and increasing emphasis, including in the popular media, about the role of the military in outer space. And we can point to various kind of events and institutions emerging, notably, of course, the US Space Force, which was founded in 2019 under Trump's first term in the White House, as a new wing of the US Armed Forces that is set to secure the nation's interests and to space, securing the nation's interests in, from, and to space. And this surely must be the only institution, not only in the American state, but in any government body that has had a satirical television program carrying the same name be released at the same time as this was launched. And again, for looking at the West, it's not just the American state has kind of advanced along this line of militarization. Indeed, the French Air Force has added a kind of space, so it's now the Air Force and Space Force, much less remarked upon, at least in the Anglophone world. And again, Britain, in its last kind of report on its kind of geopolitical outlook for the next 10 years, published in 2020 under Boris Johnson, talks a lot about Britain as a space power and defending space power and technological competition over, and again, we can be very skeptical of Britain's role as a space power to some degree, and it, of course, nestled under the American security umbrella. But nonetheless, it's framing itself in these terms, and I think we should take that seriously. And more recently, we've seen the formation and the launch of the People's Liberation Army Aerospace Force in China. That was April of this year, which is rather kind of joining of other parts of the Chinese Air Force and military together rather than anything adding, but it's a recalibration and a reorientation towards space as a space of military competition. And we see this kind of, particularly in Western security discourses, that we're entering into a new Cold War, and that the key to that new Cold War is this new space race between China and America. And certainly we can look back to finding this in the kind of policy shift in the US geopolitics to contain China as a rival that was first announced with Obama's Pacific pivot, was it 2008, I think, and then kind of actually a high degree of continuity between Trump and Biden in offices of extending a kind of soft-ish trade war against China, notably the CHIPS Act of 2022, which was passed by Biden but had been in planning under Trump, which is to try and limit the sale and cut off supply chains of higher computer chips to China and technologies that contain American chips being exported to China and so on. And this is an attempt to kind of thwart China's technological development, and therefore its economic development, its military development, and particularly the role of those technologies in space. And this is a set of discourses shared by the state, and you can throw in the rock in the air and you'll hit one of these comments immediately, these articles every day about the new Cold War and the new space race. So this is an extremely common and widespread discourse that we're seeing. So what about the role of space resources within this geopolitical economy? So in one sense, we can see the development of space resources as a kind of paradigm shift away from space exploration to space exploitation, a shift in the fundamental orientation and motivation and direction of the human presence in outer space, transforming how outer space is framed in government. And it's kind of not all states and actors, of course, are involved in the space mining space resources ventures, but it's exerted a sort of gravitational pull that's kind of reorienting a lot of discussion about the development of the private space sector in space and its relationship to the geopolitical realm. And so we've seen over the last 10 years a huge effort to produce a market for space resources, and it's an almost kind of crystalline version of how a market is made, a capitalist market for a resource. And you mean the kind of, it's distilled, the pure neoliberal capitalism sense is kind of, this is a speculative commodity. Space mined resources don't really exist. Okay, yes, there has been some bits of sampled from asteroids and some bits from the moon, but not as commercial ventures as yet. Those have all been part of state science exploration programs. So in one sense, space mining may never happen, but as was said earlier by Bethany, this is already happening. It may never happen, but it's already exists. It's a kind of a concrete fiction, and even though the commodities that lie behind it are speculative, it's been very successful in trapping flows of capital and capturing the state. And many actors are involved in this, from kind of lobbyists such as the Space Frontier Foundation, which I'll come back to, lobby corporations such as Planetary Resources and Deep Space Industries, two of the early prominent space mining companies that existed basically to promote the sector, and they both went bankrupt and were bought over. Lots of diverse kind of media actors, as well as government bodies and state actors. And the cry kind of went out that there was going to be this bonanza of minerals and so on that could exist in space, but that perversely, this discourse being very libertarian, there was also an appeal to the state. So the state was needed in order to underpin this economy by recognizing property that would allow stable investment to be made. So there's an appeal for the state as an investor, but also to kind of underpin the financing so that private ventures, angel investors and so on could come to buy into space mining. So this huge amount of lobbying work, again, these are some of the more academic books that we've seen produced about this. So again, the state is kind of been the prime actor in this, and I think we should think about it in these terms, although the state has responded to the action of lobby groups. I should mention also banking. Goldman Sachs and Knight Frank and major investors are also have been promoting this since at least 2016. So the US Space Act that was already mentioned earlier signed into law in 2015, and the US being the first state to recognize private property rights for materials extracted in outer space from celestial bodies, the moon, asteroids, and so on. This was confined to US citizens, and I'm actually never sure, and I read it and I still wasn't sure how it's confined to US citizens, because it seems a bit slippery as to like what the test for citizenship is, or like if you could be Elon Musk, who's Canadian, doesn't hold an American passport, has a company that he wants to set up doing this, would he not be eligible? I doubt it. But this, of course, exists within US domestic legislation. In some ways more interesting was Luxembourg, which came later in 2017, the second state. And it was Luxembourg being a very crafty little state, it needs to be very plucky because it's very small, used its model of foreign direct investment as financialization to say you just have to have a letterbox company in Luxembourg, and then you can avail of investment packages, grants, tax exemption, competitions for funding and so on. So there was a kind of a carrot offered to attract companies. It was very successful, and Luxembourg has tried to position itself, as I'm sure many people here know, as this kind of international hub, not only of the commercial space sector, but specifically of space mining. And of course, drawing on its history, industrial policy history of extraction and the early ventures in the satellite business in the 1980s. And it's also used the kind of a type of kind of industrial diplomacy to try and kind of shift the governance framework through which space resources and space mining is seen more broadly internationally, and I think has had great success in doing so in the European Space Agency. I remember when I first started doing this work, the European Space Agency was very, very reluctant and wary of space mining and wanted to put regulations in place, and is now basically fully on board, albeit with saying there needs to be more regulation. And pushing, again, the Luxembourg government kind of pushing Luxembourg's kind of leadership role within a certain version of kind of Middle European neoliberalism, where the kind of state will act as this kind of a long-term developer, but that market actors will be at the core of that, and kind of collaborations between the state and industry. I'm going to slip a little bit ahead. The reason I'm wearing a suit today is because I think, I never wear suits and I feel quite weird, but the previous times I've come to Luxembourg, I went to these events or similar ones that were the New Space conferences that were in this building on the other side of the room. And I was always like trying to pass in this kind of corporate context. Don't know, the second time I went, some of the people were looking at me weird, being, there's the guy again. Why does he not speak to anyone? He's a spy or something. But who does he work for? The Irish space program. So it must be some type of trauma that I wore a suit. But anyway, I feel overdressed. But interestingly about this, and there's one coming up in 2 weeks or something like this, 3 weeks' time. It's run every year, and this conference was built on the back of the New Space Conference, which happens in the United States every year for about 30 years, and that is a conference set up and run by the Space Frontier Foundation, who have kind of gentrified themselves to pass as respectable, but they're like an arch libertarian, right-wing, similar to the kind of Cato Institute, think tank and lobby group for the private space sector. They've had a lot of success in pushing for the private space sector in the US. And the Luxembourg state kind of collaborated with them in the early years, but I think they have dropped their partnership. And I'd be very curious to know if anyone has details about why that is. I imagine they might have made some type of whoopsie at some point. But again, yeah, this kind of idea of a kind of industrial diplomacy, and that kind of there's a spin-off event from this New Space Europe is the kind of Space Resources Week, which Luxembourg has hosted every year since I think 2019, and with all sorts of activities to engage the public as well as kind of business leaders. So getting to the geopolitics of it, and hopefully I have about 4 more minutes. I don't know how long I've been speaking. But so the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, we've already heard it mentioned, a document of its definitely much born of its era, the Cold War, which was aimed to kind of prevent the weaponization of outer space, i.e. prevent the type of conflict that happened between the Houthis and Israel recently, and prevent great power conflict from spiraling in outer space. And at the core of that was an attempt to ban territorialization and territorial conquest, because this would be a driver of military conflict in space and on Earth. And crucially, it was Article 2, which the quote seems to have disappeared, and I don't know it off by heart, but it ends on, there'll be, we've already heard as well today, no state shall be able to claim kind of territory on the moon or any other celestial body, and that it shan't be done by conquest or appropriation of territory in any way. And then the last clause of the sentence is, or by any other means. Right? And this has become a hotly contested phrase in the legal discussions around these legislations from America, Luxembourg, UAE, and Japan that have followed suit since. We're saying kind of these private property recognition regimes within domestic legislation are run against international law, and they're illegal by international law. And this has kind of become the kind of debate. And as I said, Luxembourg has been very effective at acting as a kind of honest broker in shifting the debate, particularly within the European Space Agency on this, moving towards its private property regimes and domestic legislation are compatible with the Outer Space Treaty, and the Outer Space Treaty needs to be rewritten, and so on and so on. We see this argument starting to win out by sheer force of the United States' presence in it, and Japan joining also really shifted the dial on this. So what I would like to argue is that actually these private property regimes in domestic legislation are territorialization by other means. The state is present as a sovereign entity that underpins the private property with recognition of its sovereign acting. So there's a kind of sovereign state acting there. So private property becomes kind of a proxy for state territoriality. And of course, we need to think what territory means when we're thinking about asteroids that may be landed on and extracted from, and then the kind of company move on. But this kind of, nonetheless, this kind of state recognition acts as this kind of alchemy that turns plunder into right, the commons into private property. And this is something that we've been very familiar with from the entire history of European colonial empires since the 15th century, and the concurrent and related historical development of global capitalism. And we've seen this relationship between private venture and private appropriation of resources and state territorialization and the expansion of imperial power. There's almost this kind of symbiotic dynamic between this, and this is present from the British first colonial venture, which was in Ireland, which was the plantation of parts of Ireland after defeating the kind of the local clans and kings who were trying to resist English rule. And here we had English privateers given plots of land. And in fact, the Bank of England, or the Proto-Bank of England, was set up in order to facilitate this. So the English crown set up the model of the Bank of England in order to give loans to pirates, and they gave them concessions of land. So, and this was private venture, and some of them failed, and they left the land. The land was given to others. Of course, most famously, the Dutch East India Company. These models of private companies that will act as kind of frontier actors to expand state territorialization and imperial expansion, and again, the settler colonial process in the United States is familiar from this. This makes then kind of the development of space resources the kind of, again, a kind of almost crystalline or distilled caricature of a capitalist resource frontier as a kind of expanding capital accumulation, resource extraction, and state expansion or territorialization, albeit that territorialization taking new forms in the off-world area. And Anna Singh was evoked earlier today as well, and I want to evoke her yet again. Her discussion of kind of frontier spaces or frontier dynamics are these spaces that are developed in the imagination as both empty and full at the same time, or empty but full. And empty of order, empty of value, empty of any social relationships that need to be respected, but full of resources and potential profit to be extracted. And I think what Singh is really expert at doing is showing how the processes of resource extraction and capital accumulation go hand in hand with the expansion of state ordering. And you know, she looked at the kind of marginal forest lands in Malaysia, and some of her work in Indonesia and some of her earlier work, and kind of figured these places as margins to the capitalist system, albeit within the kind of terrestrial sphere. And what we're seeing is that we're seeing spaces that are, again, marginal to the kind of a planetary regime becoming these spaces that are projected onto with these resource frontier areas. So last two slides. Imperialism abhors a vacuum. What was I saying in this? Oh yes, this is very briefly, maybe we can come back to this. Previous kind of project that I started and have not finished yet about the United States Geological Survey, kind of mapping the history of the US GS, as it's known, from various roles that it as a state science institution, a geological, providing geological science to the state, as well as private companies, has played in the advancement of the United States as a settler colonial state building project after the Civil War to kind of now find what mineral wealth the newly formed United States had, then into its kind of expansion from the end of the 19th century, the start of the 20th century, as we've known, the kind of imperial expansion of the United States, where its interests are identified beyond its boundaries, and now in the 21st century, that being shifted off Earth into these kind of the extraplanetary interests of the United States and the role that geologic science plays in that, with the United States Geological Survey setting up a particular program about space resources, which they're collaborating on with the Colorado School of Mines, who Fred was mentioning at lunch. And in building these educational program, training kind of future miners or the tools to do assessments on space resources off Earth. So kind of shifting the patterns of the modes of imperialism that the US state is defined by, and is kind of shifting geographic parameters of its interests. And lastly, to end on this, because the world has changed somewhat in the last couple of days, which has been it was not a surprise, but it's still a shock. Certainly the shock to the extent of Trump's second electoral victory. And what this will mean for, I think, talking about conflict and geopolitics of outer space, the development of the space industry, but also the kind of fate of the inverted commas, rules-based order. And we see a lot of hand-wringing in the liberal press about the threat that Trump poses to the rules-based order. I think for many people around the world, the behavior of the West and the United States in particular in relationship to Gaza and what's been going on and the actions of Israel has already torn up what was left of the rules-based order, particularly with the hypocrisy regarding the reaction to Ukraine. So the rules-based order is still needed, even if we approach it as a kind of somewhat strategically as a political tool, and we suspend our disbelief to leverage it. And I have skepticism of its norms, but certainly without it, we'll be in a much worse place. And we're definitely in a situation where this can be fully, what tattered remnants are left of it, can be fully abandoned, and particularly the role of this person, who is kind of, in some sense, the most mediated and talked about person. I'm reluctant to even have him here, but still remains somewhat of an unknown quantity. In his peculiar mix of ideology and opportunism, and his vast desire for geopolitical influence and power. As to why he wants that or what he wants to do with it, I can't be sure. But the fact that he now has a chance to have an enormous amount of capture over the most powerful government in the world, and in fact has been muted as a kind of secretary of government to streamline the US government along the lines of SpaceX, is extremely terrifying, and I think leaves us sitting on the precipice of a new era of a geopolitical economy of outer space. And I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Rory. Anna Maria, you can go next.
Thank you. Yeah, what a place to leave me off for that last...
With 7 minutes left.
But I really, that was great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Marija. Thank you, Nick, who is the reason I'm here. Thank you to Julia and Thomas for their patience with me. Thank you to everybody who has given us delicious food. Really, it's been wonderful. I feel I kind of won the lottery because I have worked on issues of lunar standard time quietly, privately on my own. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a historian of science, although I am a historian of science groupie. I am not a science and technology studies scholar. My background is in forensic anthropology, and that was a lifetime ago, actually, a decade of work that pretty much centers on vitality, let's put it that way. You understand how people lived by studying how they die. And I am now 180 degrees into art, not going through in any way forensic art, which has had its own category in architecture, but really kind of trying to get to baseline elements of vitality, which I hope to talk about, understanding that vitality itself is a contested term and how do you precisely define it. But here we go. So that's minuscule font, so forgive me for that. And this is not going to be any better. But you'll have to take my word or come afterwards and see the slides up close for yourself. When I tell you that this is, let's say, the starting point for lunar standard time, insofar that the President of the United States, Joe Biden, asked NASA and the National Standards, NSIT, I'm going to mess this acronym up, but the Standards and Technology, National Institute for Standards and Technology, thank you, to be able to come up with a reliable form of timekeeping in space. And it is, let's say, has an analog, which is universal coordinated time, which some of you know started in 1972, and is an inheritance of multiple generations, let's say, of trying to have universal timekeeping, of which it bears mentioning, especially because I do think it's important to bring back empire, that the first attempts of having coordinated universal standard time, so to speak, were in fact very much rooted in Victorian culture of seeing the world as a resource. And I don't think it's ill-timed, actually, to bring back that discussion, which has had a lot of ink spilled in terms of the colonial freight luggage weight of having, Greenwich be the meridian that set the time for the world based on privilege of commerce, individual commerce of the UK, mostly. And in this case, I want us to think about time with that inheritance, but I really actually want to position it in something that is closer to us, actually, as just, let's say, human beings, with regards to a universal time not being something infrastructural, although great, nothing against the infrastructure panel. Let's talk about our bodily infrastructures, so to speak, very baseline, because we all have an experience with time. I have a fraught relationship with time myself. I use this device, which I need to keep time on so I don't bore you into a long, endless monologue, but basically you can live without your clock. You might not, but you can live and carry out your day, if you wish, without having UTC be part of your day-to-day. You can ignore it. So what time is it on the moon actually is an interesting prospect for the people who will be on the moon, of which there's only been, as I think, and if anybody can correct me, 12 human beings on the moon. Punkt. That's it. But this is, every technology innovation has to have the freight inheritance of what came before. And for better or for worse, we think this universal coordinated standard time is going to translate into two dimensions. One is the infrastructure, but the other is the bodily reality of the people who will inhabit the moon if that so far happens. So I want to bring into here, I think, the strength, because yes, you will have to live with this possibly for a very long time, of the idea of inhabitation, which I think architects are, one of the experts to do so, and the question of lived time, the lived experience of time. So I'm going to perhaps not deliver in a promise on lunar standard time, although I'm happy to return to this, but we all have, let's say, some notion of a day that has a division of light and darkness. Some of you might live more in the dark. Some might be living more in the light. But by and large, this defines our existence, not just in terms of like our social conventions, but it also is what organizes, if you will, a certain set of collective activities. And internally, physiologically, we have a chronobiology. Our body responds to different conditions of light and darkness, activity and rest. It affects our metabolism, our periautomatic system. We just simply cannot take away our lived vital experience in habitation, collective inhabitation on Earth from a chronobiological system. You may have seen and asked yourself, why did I have this animation going? But let's just start with a baseline, let's say, of projecting not UTC, but the day onto the moon. On the moon, I've heard, it's 14 days of light and 14 days of darkness is the equivalent of the rotation while it goes around Earth, the place of UTC, let's say, so to speak. So already, whoever is on the moon is going to have to live with the 14 days of darkness and 14 days of light. I don't know about you, but the first thing I think about is, what is their 8-hour day? And true, there are capsules for sleep, and true, there's all kind of conditions with regards to kind of trying to replicate some kind of, let's say, earthly, terrestrial pattern. But mining industry does not give us a very good precedent in terms of kind of calibrating, let's say, daily efforts into, let's say, an underground dark environment. If anything, it could be a 24-hour rotation, a shift, of which we're very primed, unfortunately, here on Earth. But okay, let's continue with the question of time, because we have to move along. You also not only have a relationship to night and day, but you have some idea that the moon has cycles, and you have to be able to map a month roughly into this. And all that lived experience, which has been way longer for us as a humanity, is now going to get, let's say, vacuum wrapped, vacuum sealed, to think about the moon clock. And the moon clock is going to have as its infrastructure, as this slide says, again, in equally minute font, the idea that atomic clocks, which are based on rare earth minerals, are are kept by laboratories around the world that have a certain level, let's say, of cooperation and regulation to be able to continually have this idea of universal coordinated time, which is a human soft infrastructure, or let's say soft infrastructure that relies on a lot of heavy infrastructure. Sorry to just keep borrowing on the infrastructure panel, but don't worry, the first one, the resources is coming. And so that infrastructure of which we've only had, let's say, a 50-year, give or take, experience is now going to go to, let's say, I would say, a common heritage, millennial, cultural, however you wish to see it, of understanding the moon as a baseline technology, perhaps, for how to exist, which to me feels like a very important point rather than just simply skipping over it, which is why I've belabored, perhaps, this point. But we carry on, and it's important because moonlight, it's conveniently, the European Space Agency, calls this process of timekeeping actually something that is light-based. I don't think this is a coincidence or a romantic sort of whim of fancy. It really is that time for us at a base level is light. And for life on Earth, not just us, let's not be so anthropocentric, to non-human life. Okay, long preamble to get back to the moon as, unfortunately, a resource that is, or framed as a resource which is actually should be called a commons, I think. Because every place on Earth depends on the moon for certain cycles of vitality. You all have experience of a tide, perhaps. You have experience of that being a gravitational force that determines transport. Need I remind the transport that actually set the Greenwich Meridian as the baseline? Because it was the fact that more boats passed through the UK that determined that that was the Greenwich Meridian, and not France, which really was gunning for that, but they didn't get it because of that. So we go to the moon, and I'm so sorry that the font is kind of having almost an optical illusion effect in the bottom of each slide, but these are all NASA produced images, the first one I had here of our moon, and the next two that follow. But they are the updated geological map of the moon. They are let's say, the efforts from 1971 onwards to map what are the actual, let's say, the mineral composition of the moon based on its topology, because nobody has drilled on the moon yet. We only have a surface view at best. Actually, we don't have a full surface view. There is the dark side of the moon. And we are happily assuming, but with very much a lot of solid grounded research based on the lunar specimens that have come, that the topography is going to provide a good read of efficiency for mining. And I have the benefit of having had panelists talk about these things before, so you may recall the idea of the lunar pole, the southern pole, that is the privileged space where the Artemis mission is going to begin in 2026, at least in the crewed part. Crude, not like C-R-U-D-E, but C-R-E-W-E-D. I'm trying to say something that's not, what is it, manned mission or something, and here, this is what comes out of my mouth, but what have you. This is the kind of topography to resource mapping that NASA is depending on, not just NASA actually, but this is where I sourced the imagery, to be able to determine where there is water on the moon. But unfortunately, when you say that, you've mapped your planetary terrestrial experience and you're like, water, okay, river out there. Right, precipitation that comes from a cloud and comes and goes into a source that disperses. That is not the experience of water on the moon. The experience of water on the moon is hydrogen molecules and oxygen molecules. So the actual molecular reality of water that in some instances can be in ice form, which we're familiar with, but in other instances really depends on a set of, let's call them geochemical processes, of which are not how we source water on Earth. We have, let's say, a hydrosphere that is a reliable source of the element, one of the elements that we need to survive, and that we will struggle with significantly if we don't. So it's not like you can put a tap on the moon and water is going to skirt out. What have you. That is not the case. There will be some places where you will have ice, but for the most part, I think it's fair to say here that whereas on Earth we are infrastructure, let's say, adjacent to water. Some of us are lucky to have a functioning plumbing system and have disposable drinking water, others don't. But by and large, you can still find some source of water to be able to survive, presumably, if you're in conditions of full movement and actually mobility is not a compromise. That is not the case on the moon. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that when we think about things like a work day for an astronaut, of which only 12 people have done it on the moon. Of course, the International Space Station has had many people have not many people have extremely long shifts. I think the longest is still half a year, there, give or take. Oh no, actually there was one person closer to a year. But just the situation, and I'm very grateful to Fred for having mentioned it, that we have 2 people right now that have not been able to come back on Earth easily, should be and would have been maybe in 1969 a source of planetary alarm, and not one more headline that you're just skipping. Because the thing is, they don't have a choice. There is no possibility of vitality of their own free accord if the infrastructure doesn't work. And they are lucky that right now, the International Space Station, which will be decommissioned, is existing. We don't know what the future of the International Space Station is. If anything, the International Space Station is an opportunity of diplomacy that's a marvel considering how it started, because it was actually Soviet. The Mir was the actual, and sorry for anybody who actually speaks Russian, but the structure of it came from defying polarization politically. And I don't know what 2030, if that in fact is the date, I knew that it was within the decade, but I'm not sure what's going to happen, and I don't think many people know for sure. But let's go back to this idea, because this is one of the key infrastructures to determine any operation on the moon, is lunar standard time. And the thing here that I'm trying to break down with equally minute font, that sort of top, I'm gonna have to stand up because at this point you have no idea what I'm talking about. This line over here is talking about different generations of the Artemis mission. Take my word for it. The first one with the green check mark is Artemis 1. Check. It's already happened. It's uncrewed. I know there's a better way of saying it. Artemis 2 will be crewed. overly heavy in my didactic tone. Please take it in the best possible way. I don't think you any deserve that. You're very smart to be able to probably get the drift of what I'm trying to say, is that I think these astronauts need a union. Because this, if I told any of you to go work in a place that afforded you radiation for 14 days, continual radiation for 14 days of much more exposure without the atmosphere that we have on Earth to be able to protect ourselves, however badly we treat it, we still have cloud coverage, and you still have actually other spaces for shade. That's their shade right there, literally. So 14 days of radiation, then 14 days of darkness with water sourcing that will depend primarily on your bodily fluids, which is what happens in the International Space Station. Your pee becomes your drinking water, which is amazing in itself as a technology. And then, of course, with air limitations. So air to distance limitations. You're going through the topography that's going to be mined actually has the expected resource that your air capability plus, like your external air capability, plus your body, whatever your lungs are able to actually breathe in and out, they're going to function under such circumstances, which could potentially have a moment of duress if your technology doesn't work. People who have done deep sea diving will know this better than I. I could not even snorkel, but you have a certain lived experience, as I understand it, for any of you who do deep sea diving, that it's not like you immediately go 30 meters, bam. You grow into the experience of measuring this kind of lung capacity with depth, and you have, of course, your tank. And usually you have somebody looking out for you or some idea of a contingency plan. But that is probably something that NASA has talked about, but I'm kind of trying to again say, not only do the astronauts need a union, they are human subject research. They should be treated as people who are being put into a physiological experiment, and this is why I'm very happy for the talks that happened beforehand. You can see where I'm going with this. These are N of 1 cases, I would argue. And what is N of 1? This is something I work with in my practice. Sorry, I need to hydrate for a moment. And I see I'm oscillating dangerously close to what I was hoping was the midpoint, and I'm nowhere at the midpoint, but what have you. Here we go.
You're lucky you have me as a time manager.
Well, this is, I was hoping that there would be a certain grace to the time panel, having a time presentation, having a little bit more wiggle room, but what have you. Because the thing is, N of 1 is cases of an experiment that cannot be easily replicated or should not be replicated. These are the unfortunate scenarios where people, not by their own choosing, have found themselves in life circumstances that are so exceptional that they set a paradigm for science, for medicine. They are the exceptions, the state of exception, unwillingly, that they fall into, not the rule. So what kind of N of 1 experiments are out there? Well, there are people that have become trapped, for example, in transit, often in circumstances that we wouldn't see a chance of survival, but with the resources they had, they proved they were able to carry that out. Or in the Netherlands, where I'm from, that during the war, there was a terrible famine and a whole generation of children were put to basically grow and thrive in very, very difficult circumstances. You have a generational marker that doctors can actually rely on to be able to say, this is an unfortunate event that has, lifelong consequences for you, but nevertheless, it provides scientific data that can help so that for when this happens again, or hopefully never happens again, we have information on that. Unfortunately, I don't hear any of that being referred to with regards to the Artemis mission. And I would say, my own personal belief is that the astronauts that are doing this have, not to speak for them, the idea of the astronaut that we had in 1969 or the cosmonaut that we had before that. It was a source of, I would say, worldwide pride. It was a feat. There was a captivation with going into space that it was so important that it was one of the most broadcasted events that have ever happened. And that people in different time zones, be it my parents in Colombia or probably people that are here in Luxembourg, could actually see something at the same time that was like, we have never witnessed this before. I hate to tell the people that went before me that were like saying like, oh, you know, people go to Cape Canaveral and go to see the rockets. I went to Houston. I went to see the Artemis first. There were 6 of us there. People are not treating this, and maybe it was because it was an uncrewed mission, but the people there were like, this is not what it used to be. This is not the spectacle at all. People have gotten used to it. You've seen it in movies. This is no big deal. I'm curious what will happen when actually the folks go up in space. But I focused a lot on the astronaut and the risk, and this goes back to lunar coordinated time, because asteroids, you could say asteroid, or you can say unpredictable, inanimate, yet possibly organic element in space. You could actually treat it as a satellite. And if it depends on a satellite to work, it becomes a para-satellite. Basically, we're kind of taking, this is all speculative, this hasn't been done either. But you have noticed perhaps in recent years the kind of latent but not totally flourishing hysteria that happens when somebody says there's an asteroid coming too close to Earth's orbit. If you shatter an asteroid, presumably somewhat close to Earth's orbit, chances are something might go wrong, and one piece of asteroid comes a bit too close, a bit too fast. And that is going to hurt us, or whoever is unlucky enough to be on the other side of that asteroid coming. I'm going to really go fast because I'm having I see this arc, unfortunately, might hold, but what do I do as an artist? I actually work with a lot of the things I did as a forensic anthropologist, which the basis is not just the 208 bones that you have in your body, but it's the actual process of how those bones interact in an environment. That's really what you're seeing, not just identification, but time and place of death and manner of death. And that's not just a forensic issue in an anthropocentric way, or anthropogenic actually, but for any life on Earth. And that process, the transfer of material from the biosphere, organic inanimate matter, to the lithosphere, is actually what creates most of our geology on Earth that we know of in terms of sedimentary rock, for example, which is the majority of what we exploit for built environments. And actually is a planetary biogeochemical process that is so important, yet I find is not often talked about, because we, and when I say we, let me preface this to saying, let's say the Western education around the life sciences has prioritized the life cycle from birth to death rather than what happens after death, which has been treated mostly as a subject of cultural ritual for a very long time, and certainly something of interest only to farmers, hunters, or people who deal with burial. That's pretty much it. But that kind of process of the biogeochemical is what would actually, in a very small format, keep the astronauts alive or habitable. One of the big industries that is happening in terms of what could be the, let's say, the next step after the Artemis mission, that's a shorter time frame, but the 3 and 4 that come up, is you can't, it's prohibitive to bring construction materials of any kind from Earth to the moon. You're going to have to make it, which is what is there. And literally, that's not just the topography or the geological resources of the moon, it's your physical body. What they're doing is testing if blood, urea, spit, feces, what have you, can be brought into contact with basically moon rock, whatever the mineral composition of that particular rock may be, to create some kind of building material. But the thing is, there's 2 times there, and this is why I think not thinking about lunar standard time only in terms of a, like say, chronometric measurement, but a chronobiological, and also a, I don't know how to refer it, but let's call it ecological in the moon, because we are a living being, and even if the moon does not correspond to the animacies or vitalities that we know, it certainly doesn't mean that what is in the moon does not explain vitality outside of our planet. What I mean is, even though there is no life on the moon, other than ourselves, when we go there, chances are that some of the building blocks of life are on that moon, because that has been a surface area, topographically, of all kinds of micrometeorites and elements that might explain astrobiologically what happens in other places. That will be lost entirely as a source of information unless it's treated kind of paleontology now in a mining environment, which is if by grace a certain mining industry finds it important to give a paleontologist a fossil every now and then, literally throw them a bone, then you're able to look at some species. But if you ask me, I don't think that's going to happen on the moon, A, because there's not going to be something that we can charismatically empathize as an organism. It's going to be likely something so small that won't be prioritized and will just kind of be treated as a bypass in every kind of event of mining. It also is something that we don't know yet. We don't know what we're looking for. That's something that we learned, of course, with Bethany's talk with regards to the extremophile analog. We are actually trying to constantly look at how to study that which we don't know. And that which we don't know is something that we're also actively, unfortunately, destroying in our end with the mining industries we have on Earth that don't necessarily always correspond with the scientific interests of how biogeochemical processes happen on, for example, from early Earth, where the conditions we depended on the microorganismic to actually have that transition into oxygenate our global sphere. And there's so much still missing there that I want to bring that lived experience you might have, whatever it might be with paleontology or geology, which is probably minimal and media inflected, but nonetheless bring that into thinking what we know about the lunar geological timescale, which there have been very informed kind of mappings on, but which is still so partial that any kind of very aggressive, let's say, treatment of the surface might have us lose things we will not see otherwise. And for anybody wanting to go to Mars and thinking of the moon as kind of a pit stop before going, which is actually how SpaceX is talking about Mars exploration, you're kind of missing the target of actually learning from the moon, perhaps some things that you might need for that trip to Mars, just saying. But we really are not at a place where we can understand the complexity of our geological timescale, this image, to the moon. We're really not there. As an artist, one of the things I'm fascinated by, aside from N-of-1 experiments, is the conventions with which we use the body and what is an accepted behavior with our body in social terms and what is actually physically possible. And so, for example, I think the regoliths, the lunar regoliths, is a very good example of that. You don't normally think you're going to build with your feces, although we use animal feces all the time here on Earth. But you're kind of having to see yourself in real time as a source and as the person who is going to live in that thing you have produced with what you source. Plants are really good at this. They have actually the infrastructure to handle it, and this is an example of an array of plants being grown in lunar regoliths. Quick note, they really don't like it. Most of the experiments prove very difficult, and so any kind of cultivation will likely still happen outside of the moon's surface and the International Space Station. But what we don't know, and what the astronauts that have been generous enough to provide this as a service, I would say quite literally to the entire planet, is all the conditions that happen in different gravitational circumstances over time under activities that go beyond simply moving on the surface of a topography, but involve actually interacting and learning while doing how to handle things like drilling at a small scale or at a massive scale, how to deal with projectile circumstances produced by your own activities, all the things that one learns on the job, hopefully on Earth, they will not have the chance to do. It is too difficult even to assume all the circumstances and all the variables they'll have to deal with, hence why I think astronauts are an N-of-1 experiment. But we do have an intense, in this, again, minute font, a series of physiological studies on the long-term effects that astronauts have with regards, for example, to bone density, to regards to circulation, if there was a pre-existing condition, for example, with regards to healing in space compared to healing on Earth, and what that would take, for example, in depending on the kind of injury. So I'm going to say, I'm going to need 7 more minutes, and I don't want to sacrifice on the questions, but that's how my clock is going.
Of open end, because we have also some time for closing discussion. So I think a lot of questions you're asking we can
all right.
also tackle.
We will zoom very fast in some things, and I'm happy to talk at length at a Q&A about some of them. This is the beginning of a paper that I'm doing with regards to thinking of closed ecological systems, because that is essentially what the International Space Station is, a support system for life that is closed and has to work with all of its resources. One of the self-experiments I've done is germinating a seed in my eye using a silicone prosthetic. This is not a project that was space-inspired per se, but has been the basis for thinking about how one uses one's human resources in ways that are not, there's an unfortunate something label there, but what have you. The technology is starting to rebel. This is a technical diagram of the small-scale prosthetic that I used, which is something that's actually quite common. It's for people with dry eye, for whom artificial tears no longer work. There is this possibility of an ophthalmologist putting a tiny plug in your tear duct so that the moisture in your eye, the tears or the lacrimal fluid, go into that small capsule rather than into your nasal lacrimal passage and basically re-irrigate your eye. So it's something that perhaps doesn't depend on you having to have artificial tears, but let's say your body automatically does it. It's hollow enough to fit a small seed, and in that kind of appropriation of an existing technology, I facilitated the existence of another organism without knowing if it would work or not. But nothing was really at stake there other than my ego. Okay, both screens have gone. So I'm getting the message. They're turning the lights off. Well, the plug has a similarity to this. This did not inspire the project, but this is Tioskolsky, Konstantin Tioskolsky's idea of a floating garden on orbit around Earth. For those of you who don't know, Tioskolsky, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing and butchering his name, was the person who empirically came up with the idea of rocket propulsion. He was a physicist, deaf physicist in Russia before the Soviet Union and during the Soviet Union, also carried out work as a scientist and as a physics elementary teacher. And he came up with this kind of really interesting structure of having the possibility of humans exist while keeping and tending to a garden on while they carried out this orbit around Earth. And that orbit would loosely match what we now call the geostationary and the geosynchronous. Bear with me. Rory was kind enough to talk about low Earth orbit. Basically, we're talking about a longer or larger kind of orbit, which is what's used for timekeeping and telecommunication satellites. You need something far enough from Earth that's not going to bump into the space debris, and it's entirely reliable based on the gravitational pull on Earth. And what is one of the most reliable things we have? Our equator, the basis of basically being able to think quite literally of something stable enough to be able to carry out these technologies. And this is one of the areas that is being talked about as a site for being able to keep this lunar standard time. This is what it currently looks like now. It is a slotted system where really countries in the global north have to ask the International Telecommunications Union to be able to basically rent your satellite there. And in theory, it's for everybody on Earth, but the reality is very few countries that are in the global south actually access this. And we use the same image. I've used several images, actually, that others have used. It's amazing what happens when you do have cash on hand to be able to monopolize not just a technology or an industry, but essentially an orbital sphere. It is a gravitational orbit that is being monopolized also. It's not just simply the fact of carrying something that the state should carry out. And it's not just SpaceX, but yes, Musk is, as of 48 hours ago, the person who probably is going to tailor the system to his own benefit financially. Even though we don't only have several treaties that have already been talked about at length before me, we have recently the Artemis Accords that kind of builds on the idea that whatever happens on the moon should be of a benefit beyond, basically. And by in the moon, I mean specifically the Artemis mission. And some of these things have already been talked about. the Outer Space Treaty, so I don't need to go there necessarily, or these timelines that you've talked about. Rather, I want to go to a place of possibility. And I want to end this so that you are free of me talking, and I hear you talk. But one of the things I love as an artist, aside from self-experimentation, is going into history and seeing paths that could have been taken that weren't, because this is what we have as a collective resource. And I'm very proud to say that Colombia, the country where I'm from, led an initiative, a South-to-South initiative, called the Bogota Declaration of 1976. And the Bogota Declaration of 1976 was, yes, there were several Latin American countries there, Venezuela, Ecuador, Peru, but not only. Uganda, then Zaire, now Democratic Republic of Congo, the Republic of Congo, and Indonesia were also there. And together, they proposed that anything that was precisely of the geostationary orbit, so that orbit that I talked about before, is a natural resource. It should not be privately monetized. It is as much a natural resource as water, as biodiversity, as basically the airspace above a country's territoriality. It's just expanded very far. And part of the reason that was justified for that is because the effects of what happens in that orbit in terms of radiation, asteroid, gravitational pull will hurt, basically, if it goes wrong. So losing the ability to be able to monitor that, or having it be in another state's kind of decision-making, makes it so that that is something that affects the livelihood of Colombia in this case. And so President Alfonso López Miquelsen made this kind of proposal of this declaration becoming a treaty, or something that actually kind of annotated, rather, the existing legislation of the Outer Space Treaty. So important was it that Maribel can attest to this. Those of us who grew up in Colombia and were alive and in school in 1991, even as elementary school children, that was the time, the year that our Constitution changed. And there was a massive educational campaign for having students understand what was changing. And one of the things is precisely in that tiny, minute font, what I'm going to read in a very minute font. Here. What's in yellow, it says geostationary orbit segment, and the kind of general sentence where it comes from is, also part of Colombia is the subsoil, the territorial sea, the contiguous zone, the continental shelf, the exclusive economic zone, the airspace, the segment of the geostationary orbit, the electromagnetic spectrum, and the space in which it operates, in accordance with international law or the laws of Colombia in the absence of international regulations. So, technically speaking, Colombia could, and all the other countries, of course, that also signed on to this, could be able to say legally, hey, we want our natural resources back. That didn't work in 1976. I'm not sure that it would work today, but I wouldn't want to assume it rather than giving it a try. And so this is where, not being a lawyer, I depend on those who are environmental lawyers in my circuit, or people who are willing to hear me talk perhaps as much as you have patiently, on is it possible to revive this discussion? Because while Starlink doesn't use the geostationary orbit, one could start to make the case that if that far out area in space is part of a natural resource, why wouldn't the others be? And wouldn't that actually allow for some kind of remuneration of basically the usage of airspace? I know, you might think that's pie in the sky, but there are other things, and this was with, I will really end, because this is the only part of my talk that I really wanted to make sure I read. Just to recap on things that you can do with regards to 2026, and please take any of these ideas, these are not proprietary, any effort, I think, and all effort should happen. One is astronauts should unionize, and the ILO should recognize that, not just as a cool category. Every astronaut should have, at this point, some kind of working document they could rely on, and to have them be overly informed of the risks insofar that they are an N of one experiment. And that leads me to point number 2, which is that they should be treated as human research subjects, and not only as workers. Because vitally speaking, they are doing two jobs at once. They are working for the man, and they are working themselves out. There should be, and this is now the imaginary side, the idea that the universal in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights should also mean and extend to the universal insofar as space area. I'm not the first person to say this, but I do think it's, rather than thinking of another thing that can help, really rely on the treaties and charters, even for however badly they might be treated, as per Bethany's perforation of one of them, but still. And frankly, there are other things that I feel should be part of the discussion. The alteration of the lunar surface, the permanent alteration of the lunar surface is actually a huge risk, especially if we do consider that Mars is a destination, in terms of losing vital information with regards to what are space processes that we don't even know about, and that I will just call geochemical, lunar activity. I think this should be taught in the school curriculum. There was a level of space literacy out of just sheer fandom, as somebody else said before, but also out of just curiosity that I don't think children have now that children in the 60s had, and this should be part of the mandatory curriculum if there's going to be a permanent inhabitation of the moon. Children should know that this is a special event, that this is so exceptional that it's almost like the moon landing. Mm-hmm. And last but not least, the question of the non-aligned movement, which still exists. As long as NATO exists, the non-aligned countries exist, the non-aligned countries movement, and in this regard is a potential way of bringing in, for example, the African Space Agency as a stronger player, not in terms of its lack of being a strong player historically, but just having to be able to talk about things, for example, natural resource or geostationary orbit as natural resource. I'm going to stop this now. As you can see, I've departed slightly from Lunar Standard Time, as it is going to be talked about, the equivalent of UTC, but I think relying it heavily on chronobiology, on deep time in deep space, and in sort of the idea of the temporal that is familiar to people rather than the scientific expert that talks about it, is very important to bring into the discussion. And I thank you for your patience, because I'm well over time.
Thank you so much. Thank you both so much for really, I would say, really thought-provoking, but also hyper-informed also kind of talks. I mean, we really learned so much also from these conversations. So where to start? How to connect? So Rory, I really think it was super important and interesting that you kind of brought the role of the state in the discourse around privatization of the moon, because also I think there is a kind of a layer of media, and that kind of brings me also to the first part of your talk. There is a layer of media that somehow communicates space exploitation through the presence of high technology on the lunar surface. So somehow the image of an astronaut, somehow the representative of a nation state of the 60s and 70s, has been replaced in a way by a rover, an image, of a company that develops this, high technology that suddenly, replaces. I think it also kind of opens the question of safety, but still leaves this kind of, I think, dilemma around what is the role of the company, what is the role of the state. And also this kind of led me, as you were now, Ana Maria, kind of finishing your conversation around the questions of commons and what would be the next steps, it also brought me to the work of Alice Gorman, that we were very lucky to get to know her work through a recommendation by Fred. Also, when Rory was joining the workshop of how to mine the moon, she was also kind of a guest in the workshop as well. So she really works around the notion of heritage and kind of opening up the perspective on what are the commons on the moon. I think she also in a very interesting way showed this double-sided coin called heritage, where she also discussed the ways in which, for instance, NASA claims traces of the early rovers, as well as I think also some pieces of garbage which were left on the moon as a form of heritage of early space exploration. Therefore, also in a way claiming the land which is under those objects, right? So whether they're pieces of objects like, I don't know, a kind of a part of a machine or just a trace, I think it kind of, she showed very, in a very interesting way how, for instance, the tool of heritage actually once misinterpreted also appears as a tool for land grab. And I think this opens up into a very interesting and very relevant discussion around the commons, right? So how do we, which kind of instruments, legal instruments of preservation, other kinds of, you know, like forms of knowledge or regulation, could we imagine as tools for another way of seeing the moon, right? I think there was also, if I'm not mistaken, in 2021, there was an initiative which was called the Declaration for the Rights of the Moon, which was an attempt, I think also Alice Gorman was part of it. Fred, correct me if I'm wrong, I think yes. So it was a kind of an attempt to declare the moon as a protected area through the concept of environmental personhood, a legal concept of environmental personhood. So I would just like to hear from you, how do you see, in a way, through the perspectives that you somehow brought to the table, how do you unpack this notion of commons? How do we also, in a way, critically take the notion of commons, which somehow, by its definition by Elinor Ostrom, means you know, equal governance of resources. So even the notion of commons already embodies the notion of resources in itself. So do we need, in a way, another kind of vocabulary on one side? Do we talk about the moon as a comrade instead, or through the perspective of kinship? So that's one part of the question. And second part of the question, maybe also to kind of reflect on the existing tools that you, I think, very briefly kind of outlined, and what could be their power and what could be the other side, let's say, of this kind of legal or other kinds of instruments that you have in mind. I really like the Astronaut Union. I think that's somehow something that is really like already kind of there as a project almost, no, like could be imagined to be a project there. So please go ahead. Yeah, I will then leave to Nick. Yeah.
Unfortunately, most of the astronauts come from a very anti-union country, which is the United States. And so I think the pressure, and I please understand that when I say this, I'm not trying to be insensitive to Alice's work or anybody who claims the question of a vocabulary or a language as a way to enter the conversation. I actually think the commons is having a body, a human, and forgive me, not trying to reduce the non-humans that have died in space, but I actually want to go to something more base, which I feel perhaps I'm reckoning with the effects of the last 48 hours of what happens when overly rhetorical gestures do not land in trying to create collective action behind things that could actually benefit the people who are against them. So I would say appealing to the life of someone who is working themselves in unfair conditions, I think and hope, well, that already I can see that is not the case, because, you know, there are conditions that will prove it to the contrary, but if you appeal to the human commons in that this is an unfair circumstance that the astronauts are being an N of one experiment and working privately, I think that we might have a bigger chance of stopping 2026 being the date for the Artemis mission. I personally, I would say there's no reason temporally that 2026 is a favorable time to carry out the activities. And I would like to think that there's a lawyer sharper than I or somebody that can make the argument that this is human exploitation. It's not just space exploitation, it's human exploitation. And by saying that, I'm not trying in any way to compare the circumstances of this exploitation with historic exploitation that has happened and actually provided the infrastructure and the conceptual and I would say physical infrastructure for being able to accumulate wealth, such as the Dutch East Indies Company. But I will say that this is where private profiteering, standing for a state, which is the relationship that right now Elon Musk has with NASA, especially as now Trump will be president of the United States. This is a situation that went from like moderate fear to completely off the roof. And so I'm just trying to think what could change? And one is the example of two people right now who haven't been able to return to the moon is to Earth is a pretty darn good argument to be like, should we really rethink this 2026 scenario? This is one of the key parts, and actually reaching out to them and to the astronauts, because I'm like, what would you feel if you were in this circumstance? Number one. And number two is the question that the bodily commons that we have is the basis for habitation of the moon, not just our body in terms of its traversal, but actually altering the surface. So why is there a private patent on regoliths? This is something that actually brings into patent law very squarely, and this is something I am looking at because I'm interested in having that discussion actually legally. Why, if my saliva and your saliva produce the same thing, is it possible for someone to claim a patent on that? And I think this is something where I need a sharper legal mind, because I can carry out artworks that perhaps trigger the imagination, but I don't see that baseline discussion happening, and I'm afraid that if we go through the language of heritage commons, we will lose people entirely, I think.
Yes, I would say for me, it's not either or. I think the language also helps us somehow imagine otherwise, but collective action is crucial, and I think you're completely right. So maybe they can somehow inform each other as well.
I'm trying to reach to a possible Trumpist, basically, and being able to make this argument. That really is the scenario.
Okay, thank you so much. Rory, would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, the concept of the commons, I mean, it's one that I do appeal to, but I find myself less and less appealing to it. And I mean, I think partly because of the exact reason you point to, that it still figures spaces, things, relationships as resources that can have utility. And my thinking, which is not very worked out, I have to say, is that all this should stop and it should not be made a resource. And I don't know how to get there. I did have a slide that I took away that I ended a previous talk with. That was the last slide, that was how to blow up a spaceport, which was, reference to how to blow up a pipeline. And the idea that of direct action collective against infrastructures that do not service, infrastructures of destruction. So I don't know how to get there. What do you do with Cape Canaveral or whatever? I think probably the legal, and again, legal tools and legal processes and forms of direct action do not have to be opposed. Often making successful popular demands uses kind of both sets of tools. And I think the commons as a legal category, the legal categories always exist within their kind of a political outside, so we're kind of using them, trying to leverage them this way or that. And they always facilitate and block certain sets of processes and make them easier or not. The commons, I don't know if it's a good one to do. And even the Bogota Declaration, which you restored my Declaration, you restored my kind of sense of it as kind of quite utopian, where there's other versions of it that are like, this was in some sense also trying to claim a resource for sovereign governments and a territorialization, which is kind of what I think we shouldn't be doing. So it's using the commons for one set of states to say, we should have that rather than you, which I like because they're states in the global south. Some of them were involved in the non-enlightenment movement, and it speaks to the spirit of that age, a kind of anti-imperial or anti-colonial moment. But that's not to say, had that been successful, that would have persisted as that's what those states would have been, and indeed the governments of Colombia have massively changed and since that period. So it's not a very satisfactory answer, but I think it is very negative, but my orientation is towards negating all of this and negating the idea that we should be engaged in space resources. And there's something about it, and maybe it's something I can't even quite. Maybe it's something to do with the body. I'm just like, this is mental, and like, why has this gone down so far down a route?
Yes.
And it's really mental. I don't mean just at the level I was talking about, geopolitically or economically. It's like ontologically mental, and I don't understand. And maybe the experience of coming to these events in Luxembourg before, do people believe this? And what was kind of frightening was to discover that apparently some of them do. I kind of, in some sense, I didn't even realize till I confronted these meetings that I kind of assumed a lot of this was just chat, and it was just like people finding ways to capture flows of capital, and there's a lot of that going on, but there's also a kind of true belief, which I find quite frightening, and in a way that I like maybe didn't think through sufficiently, but I have some almost response to it. I'm like, I don't know what's going on. Why do you think that would be a good idea? And, you know, and from the basis that like this is where we are, and there's all these crises here and crises of resources, and you know the idea of like Elon Musk now having more leverage on the most powerful state in the world to pursue lithium mining all across, including in Serbia, we were talking earlier, and this kind of also influence other governments, influence the European Union, to have this intensified race for critical minerals and all the destruction and inequality that it'll leave in its wake here, in order to do what? To go to do the same in outer space, for what reason? And I find it, you know, that at some level, maybe it's not about there's something there of a value, but it feels like it's something that's even below that. There's something quite material about it for me that I'm just, I don't get it at some level, you know. And maybe I'm a bad person to be talking about it then, because I'm not as sympathetic to it. Anyway.
Thank you so much. Nick, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I'll try. So, I mean, I want to. It's been a kind of reoccurring figure across the day, but I think Anna Maria, you focused on it the most, which is the question of the body, But I feel like that I would like to at least kind of raise actually the figure of the human in outer space as an open question. I think, you know, we might be able to, I mean, you know, the difference between like the rover missions that have been going on and kind of where, you know, the discussion around space is taking place today, it has to do with extractivism, but it's also about putting people in space. Mm-hmm. And I think it's done in a certain way that I wonder how it differs from back then, because, you know, like when I grew up in the United States, I always, you know, I learned about space camp and you know, we kind of grew up with these astronauts and I'm thinking about like the subjectivity of these astronauts, right? Like what kind of personalities they had, right? What kind of figures they were back then. And I mean, I wasn't around when they actually went, of course, but they seemed kind of like nice people, like generally, and I could be completely wrong in that. But when I see this now, you know, when like resource extraction is on the table, I think, you know, the history of imperialism, Roy, that you're bringing up is actually incredibly valuable to think through the lens of subjectivity, and maybe to understand a little bit more about what, you know, what the astronaut of the future might actually look like along the path that things are currently on. You know, like what were these, what kind of fanatics were ones who got on boats in Europe in the 17th century and crossed it to colonize the rest of the world? You know, I think that there is a kind of, when the colonization of Mars or the moon is spoken about today, you know, it's becoming increasingly common to speak about this as a one-way trip. So there is this, there is a kind of like acceptance of the exploitative nature of these trips is maybe not the right word, but like the intensity of these trips and the peril of these. So it's kind of creating, in a sense, a hyper valiant, but also in some ways like a hyper masculinist approach of this idea that like, oh, it's going to be tough, right? It's going to be cold, it's going to be difficult, and you're going to need to kind of to get through all of those conditions. So I don't know. I'm kind of meandering quite a lot, but I found kind of almost funny this photo of like an astronaut with a hammer like mining a rock on the moon, because there was something that just felt kind of like absurd about that. Because if we actually think about, I mean, you know, extractive industries, they are predicated on human slavery and kind kind of the exploitation of labor, but they're also massively industrialized processes. So I don't know. I guess if I had to kind of wrap up this ramble and to try and put this into a question, like one thing that I think has been kind of conspicuously absent in conversations today is the question of robotics. And so I guess my question would be would any of this be any better if humans were not putting themselves, their bodies, their corporeality directly in danger by going up there or settling on the moon, living on the moon? How would that, would that change anything if it was robots?
Is that the question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
No.
It could be it is a yes or no question, so it's not a good question. But
I would say the reality of space as it has happened so far, be it in the International Space Station, be it on the moon, as far as I understand, most missions have had an unpredictable variable that needed to be fixed, either with Houston, we have a problem, or some other way of kind of failing to foresee how a technology could fail. And those were limited missions. And those were missions that had a kind of, I would say, exploratory agenda. When you extend the risk to have it be something where it's a profit margin, even if it's robots, somebody is going to have to turn a screw every now and then. And this is where we, I think, should not have this happen in 2026 because we do not know all the risks. So let's say I don't want to curtail the space imagination that would have, as the Soviet space heritage has, the idea that a physics teacher who was deaf and living in rural, in a very limited condition, was still able to carry out some nomadic experiments to be able to then write them down and have that be the basis for rocket propulsion. I think that the ingenuity around and the space imagination element of this is something that is lost on children today. They're not going to the Artemis missions to see when to take off. Most don't know actually, even for whatever an astronaut might embody, what actually are the risks involved in something that has not been proposed up until now, which is a permanent habitation of the moon. And I think this is kind of a cutoff point for all of us, that is going to happen, and it's totally streamlined and organized by a bottom line and a profit margin. And this is where I am not saying, no to habitation on the moon per se, or even extraction, if that's unfortunately what we collectively decide in the commons. But I do feel that we are missing on very basic things we have learned from the Industrial Revolution, on putting people up there to work in these conditions, on science and space physiology, in terms of seeing what has happened to astronauts that have long-term stays on the moon, or repeated. It's not just in duration, by the way. It's also how many times you go up that can be a risk, even if you go for a short amount of time. And this is where it's, as you said, to me, it's kind of mental. I'm like, these are really basic things. I don't understand why they're not part of the conversation actively. And then there's also a public media campaign, which is what I think the artists in the room could do. And frankly, that Luxembourg is one of the places that is so important to this discussion. Like it will not get any less important from here until 2026. I think that it should be stopped personally, or that Artemis should become a public collective endeavor, of which, even if you're right, that, Columbia 1976, Columbia has had a decades-long conflict that has been pretty scary in what the state has been able to do to its citizens. Let me not say that 1976 was our high point. However, it would be, I think, a basic discussion to be like, why is the profit of using elements of our natural resources not something that could collectively benefit? Not maybe the nation state as such, but a body like the UN. If Elon Musk paid a good tax to the UN, I'd be like, that would be an ideal thing. Why can't we reach for something like this, an arbitration negotiation, where a country is willing to say that they had their natural resources continuously violated? I don't know. Here's where you see me kind of skate on thin ice. I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. I'm certainly not a labor lawyer. But I think this is the kind of argument that we actually could put forward to have it not just be something rhetorical. And going to the comments, forgive me if I'm tagging in.
No,
We need discussions on the commons, but I have to be honest, we don't treat the commons that use and fuel the space race or any kind of like rare earth mineral extractive industry, even amongst us, perhaps the choir that gets accessibly preached to and fulfills this language. The question of space rationing or rationing on rare earth minerals could also be a more active discussion that we're having here. And that would really speak to the commons. And I don't just see it often happening materially, I see it much more rhetorically, or hear it rhetorically.
Okay, thank you. I think we have to now move the discussion to the audience. Okay, 2 questions. That was fast. Whoever likes to start, Bethany.
This maybe is just quite a brief one then. So I feel like we're dancing around a subject like the one-way trip, peril and danger and risk. We talked about this briefly in How to Mine the Moon, and I can't remember which discussion it was in. We haven't had a death in space yet. We've had a death on the way, and and we've had it on the launch pads, and we've had tragic deaths there. But do you think that have you had any thoughts around that as a cultural moment, or like, will it be just another headline that we scroll past, like with the 2 trapped on the space?
That is part of the discussion of a panel I'll be next week in Utrecht on space exploration with regards to what happens with forensics in space. That is not a light question with Elon Musk, I think, on the table now, because the thing is, before you at least could have a nation-state to nation-state conversation. Now, you're dealing with somebody who's totally fine with firing and not having a union in their companies. What would happen if there's somebody who dies with an electronic car or, a space exploration? These are all hypotheticals, but this is where legally, actually, I do have some knowledge on that, and that would be homicide. And you would have to actually see the conditions of this being a 1st degree, a 2nd degree homicide, and in what conditions you are accepting the evidence, which may be lost in low Earth gravitational space. We don't know. And this is where I think 2026, if nothing else, maybe we can kind of come to a 2026 is a bit premature. That's what I'm hoping for.
Yeah, that's a great question. I wanted to ask a question about other types of precedents, maybe geopolitically, thinking about the expansion of railroads and the model, both kind of the model of corporate expansion and its relationship to the state, but then maybe also some of its impact on different kinds of culture. Thinking about like new kinds of experiences of speed, connectivity, kind of larger ways that, kind of space shuttle transit, could play out with more people having an embodied experience. So maybe just in the realm of speculation, but thinking about its like Elon Musk's his historic kind of model of kind of robber baron railroad kind of thinking.
Maybe I'll respond to that.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess one thing that didn't come up today anywhere, and it's certainly not my area of expertise, but I think it's an interesting place to think through, and it kind of relates to a number of things that have come up, is about posthumanism and the idea of the human not just having capacities that can be tested, and the human body, and different human bodies in different conditions, but that actually there may be a degree of plasticity with kind of changing the human at a more ontological level. And this is obviously a very big discussion within the kind of space field, albeit looking at kind of further futures than we're talking about. And there's some discussion there, I guess, about like the cultures of the speculative cultures of what would happen to people's like social relations, their psychologies, and so on. I like to use this thing in teaching. Often I like to show an image of, we're talking about like fossil fuel transport infrastructures and so on, and then show an image of like a dog with its head out the window of a car with the wind blowing in its ears, and just like the sheer joy of that. And of course it's like anthropomorphic projection onto like the pleasure of a dog, but humans and dogs have very close relationships. We've got some sense of their psychology and their pleasure and so on. And I love the idea that that is a new pleasure that we've provided for dogs through our infrastructure development, but how sad it is that they can't share it unless there's like 2 or 3 of them at a car at a time. It doesn't get passed on into culture in a way that we've capacity to. Anyway, yeah, so I think like the thing about kind of infrastructures and the kind of modes of transport and so on. I think for the immediate sense, we're not in a position where we could kind of develop mass kind of cultures around these things or cultural shifts, but I do, from experience, but I do wonder then about the question that Nick raised about kind of subjectivity and the kind of old model of the astronaut, the classic kind of, at least in the West, the kind of NASA astronaut, which was, it had various frames. It was very masculinist, it was nationalist, it was individualistic, and it kind of also had this universal dimension, this kind of human aspect to it. But kind of other modes of collectivity or kind of sharing were also kind of cut out of that. And I think that what we're seeing kind of now is, well, Artemis, what will be the relationships of these 4 people? We were having an interesting chat earlier about the kind of medical, and you can speak more about this, but they're training to perform medical procedures on each other, and there's 1 woman and 3 men. For example, this is, what are those relations? But also the relationships that have existed on the International Space Station, which within the American kind of space imaginary, driven both by the state and by these private actors, is just like poo-pooed, And it's like, SpaceX, we're going to send astronauts. They're still using Russian space rockets to get people to the space station. And this is, there's other forms of sociability that have developed there. And they've had to have these kind of infrastructures that have been themselves products of modes of exchange and openness and interaction that are incredibly beautiful, but they've been really squeezed out of, and that was not something just aspirational or a form of like the Moon Treaty or the Bogota Declaration. This was a material instantiation of social material relationships across not just countries and cultures, but like geopolitical rivals. And there was arguments and there was fights and there was, hissy fits and so on, but there also was this cooperation, there was friendships, and life and death scenarios for people. And I think that's a kind of something that maybe we can think about as another form of cultures that emerged in these infrastructures. They have done already, not just speculatively, but also about the types of subjectivity that we tend to, and types of relationships, so the relational subjectivities that we tend to ignore in these discussions at the minute, which is to the detriment of thinking about better modes of doing space and I'm not against all space, by the way. I'm just like, I think the space mining is mad.
Yeah.
I love space.
Yeah.
I guess we all do. That's why we're here.
Yeah.
Okay. Is there any urgent question from the audience? Otherwise, so my time management device says we're out of time. I think we can, unless there is no other question, immediate question. Sorry? So, out of earthly time. Fred? Maybe a short one. Okay, and then we can wrap up.
I'll make it short because this is 100% a comment, not a question. So, Roy, you said the commons is going to be absent from your talk, and Anna Maria, you introduced the concept of forensics and the commons as a body. So, I just want to link those 2 things together, as you both imply, which is to say that this is a sort of forensic analysis of what happened to the body of the commons in space. No. Yes. Disagree. Yeah.
I really am grateful. Hello?
Was it off?
I don't know. Can you hear me? Okay, well, let me just magnify myself without what have you. The thing is, it was really, I think, I keenly responded to you bringing mutual aid as a way of interpreting Article 5, which brings us to an anarchic, actually, scenario, Kropotkin's idea of mutual aid. I am not a forensic anthropologist anymore, and I would say that part of the problem I have with borrowing that as an adjective is that it's medical legal, so its focus is not environmental, but often kind of conditioned in a criminological inheritance of the 19th century that often doesn't really take in the cold case as the norm, but rather as a state of exception, when in fact it's the opposite. It's easy homicides that get solved and not difficult ones. And so I would actually say that a good opportunity to liberate ourselves from the forensic as a medical legal nation, that I'm for the state, but in this particular case, I think is that we have a crime that we cannot define. And that's basically the essence of my talk next week, is that we do not objectively have the variables to be able to define what is the crime that happened. Is it that was negligence? Was it that we knew already that this was dead upon arrival? I hope not, but we don't actually have the tools to argue that, and we would require a new sort of understanding of responsibility with cause and effect in contexts that even the scientists behind it don't even know all the variables that can happen. So that's...
Okay, thank you so much, Anna Maria. Thank you, Rory. Thanks also to all previous participants, moderators, speakers of today, Nick as well. Really, I would like to ask for a round of applause for a lot of interesting questions, important debates that we opened today. We now have a 1 hour break, and then we continue from 6:30. Sorry? It's 1 hour. Yeah. It's 6. No, sorry, it's half an hour. It's half an hour break. Sorry. So half an hour break, and then we continue at 6 with the conversation with Armin Linke and the screening of the film Cosmic Market. So I'll see you in a bit in half an hour. Thanks so much for a wonderful day. Thank you.